There is perhaps no figure in American mythology more thoroughly transformed by the retelling than the cowboy. He has been a film hero, a cigarette advertisement, a political symbol, a fashion statement, and a shorthand for a particular kind of rugged, self-reliant American character that the people invoking it rarely stop to examine with any precision. He has been everything in the culture that inherited him, except what he actually was. What he actually was is worth understanding, not to diminish the genuine difficulty of what he did. The work was genuinely hard, and the conditions were genuinely demanding, and the men who did it were genuinely capable in ways that deserve acknowledgement. But the specific nature of that difficulty, the specific character of those conditions, and the specific form that capability took are all quite different from the mythology, and the difference is instructive in ways that the mythology cannot be. The working cowboy of the American West in the years between approximately 1866 and 1886, the 2 decades that represent the height of the open-range cattle industry, was not primarily a gunfighter, a drifter, or a romantic solitary figure. He was a low-wage agricultural laborer, performing a specific set of skilled physical tasks in conditions of significant hardship for an employer who was typically far more prosperous than he was, under terms of employment that gave him almost no security and almost no leverage. He slept on the ground. He ate the same food for months at a time. He worked in all weather. His clothing was functional and rarely clean and wore out faster than his wages replaced it. His median working life in the cattle industry was approximately 7 years, not because he retired comfortably after 7 years, but because the physical demands of the work, the industry's boom and bust cycles, and the simple mathematics of a young man's body meant that most men either moved on to something else or were moved on by circumstances before the decade was complete. He was, in a specific and literal sense, one of the most exploited categories of laborer in 19th century American agriculture, and he was also, in a specific and literal sense, exceptionally skilled at a difficult and demanding job. Both of these things are true. The mythology has preserved the second and forgotten the first. Understanding why that happened and what the actual reality looked like requires going back to what the work actually was. The cattle industry of the American West in the post-Civil War period was built on a specific and temporary economic condition: the gap between the price of cattle in Texas, where they were abundant and cheap, and the price of cattle in the eastern markets, where they were scarce and expensive. Texas Longhorns, the descendants of Spanish cattle brought to the Americas centuries earlier and left to multiply on their own for generations, existed in the millions in the years following the Civil War. They were extraordinarily tough animals, adapted to natural selection to the specific conditions of the Texas landscape, capable of surviving on range grass that would have killed more refined breeds, resistant to diseases that devastated eastern cattle, able to walk long distances without losing the body weight that made them valuable at market. They were worth approximately $3 to $4 a head in Texas. They were worth $30 to $40 a head in Chicago or Kansas City. This price differential, 10 to 1, was the economic engine of the cattle drive era. Getting Texas Longhorns from Texas to the railroad terminals in Kansas from which they could be shipped east was the specific logistical problem that the cattle drive solved, and the cowboy was the specific human resource deployed to solve it. The cattle drive was not romantic. It was a logistical operation. The movement of a large number of difficult animals over a long distance in a limited time window. With a small workforce and minimal infrastructure, a typical drive moved a herd of 2,000 to 3,000 cattle over a distance of 500 to 1,000 miles, requiring 3 to 4 months of continuous travel through territory that was challenging in every dimension, water scarce in some sections and flooding in others, grass variable and sometimes exhausted by earlier herds on the same route. Whether it could include spring blizzards in the north and summer heat that killed animals and men alike in the south, and the constant possibility of a stampede that could kill animals, injure or kill cowboys, and scatter the herd across miles of country in a single terrifying night. The cowboy's job on the drive was to keep the cattle moving, keep them together, and keep them alive. This required specific skills, the ability to read cattle behavior with sufficient accuracy to anticipate problems before they became crises, the horsemanship to work in close proximity to large and unpredictable animals at speed, the physical endurance to work long days in difficult conditions, and the judgment to make the thousand small decisions that a cattle drive required without having the time to deliberate over any of them. These were real skills. They were not common skills. A man who had them was genuinely valuable, and the experienced cowboy who could be trusted with the full range of cattle drive responsibilities was a different kind of employee than the inexperienced hand who could be trusted with only the most basic tasks. The distinction between these two categories was real, and it was recognized by the men who hired them. The wages that recognize this distinction are worth examining with some precision, because they are one of the clearest indicators of what the mythology obscures. The average cowboy wage during the cattle drive era was approximately $25 to $40 a month, plus food and a place to sleep on the ground. A trail boss, the most skilled and experienced man on the drive responsible for all decisions about route pace water, and the management of both the cattle and the men, might earn $75 to $100 a month. The cook, whose skill was recognized as essential to the functioning of the outfit, typically earned more than the ordinary cowboys, sometimes as much as the trail boss. These wages were not negligible in the context of the 1870s. An unskilled laborer in the same period might earn $1 a day if he could find regular work, which he often could not. But they need to be understood in the context of what the cowboy's employer was making from the same enterprise. A cattleman who sent 3,000 Texas Longhorns north on a drive, purchased at $4 a head and sold at $35, was realizing a gross profit of approximately $93,000 on a single drive. The cowboys who walked those cattle to market, who spent 3 months sleeping on the ground and eating biscuits and bacon and crossing flooded rivers and managing stampedes and losing some of their number to the specific accidents of a very dangerous job, collectively earned something in the range of $1,200 to $1,500 for the entire drive. The arithmetic of this relationship is not subtle. The cowboy was essential to the enterprise, skilled in his work, and compensated at a fraction of the value he helped create. This is not an unusual arrangement in the history of labor. It describes the terms of employment in most extractive industries of the 19th century, but it is a specific and concrete corrective to the mythology of the cowboy as a free, independent figure whose work expressed a form of sovereignty that the wage laborer in the East had sacrificed to the factory. The cowboy was a wage laborer. He was dependent on employment that was seasonal, insecure, and provided by men whose interests were not his. He could be let go at the end of a drive or at the end of the season, and frequently was. He had no pension, no sick pay, no workers' compensation for the injuries that were a routine feature of the work. He had, in the language of the era, his wages and his horse and his saddle, the last two of which were frequently more important to him than the first because they were his tools and his transportation, and, in the way of working people, a source of the kind of identity that wages alone cannot provide. The food of the cattle trail is one of the more concrete illustrations of the gap between the mythology and the reality, and it deserves examination in some detail. The chuck wagon, the portable kitchen of the cattle drive invented by Charles Goodnight in 1866 and adopted across the industry with considerable speed, was a genuine practical achievement. It was designed to carry cooking equipment and food supplies for a working crew of 8 to 15 men across hundreds of miles of country, where resupply was impossible or impractical. The cook who operated it was a logistician as much as a chef, managing supplies that had to last the drive while feeding men who were burning enormous quantities of calories in physically demanding work. The diet that the chuck wagon produced was calorie-dense, protein-rich, and monotonous to a degree that is difficult to fully communicate to someone who has not experienced months of eating the same meals in rotation. Beef, always beef, in various preparations because the herd was the most available protein source, and beef that died or was slaughtered on the drive had to be used before it spoiled. Biscuits, flour and lard and whatever leavening the cook had, baked in a Dutch oven buried in the coals of the campfire. Beans, dried beans, cooked for hours until they were soft enough to eat, seasoned with whatever was available. Coffee, strong, black, available at all hours, one of the genuine pleasures of the trail and one of the cook's most important responsibilities. Occasionally dried fruit or canned vegetables, acquired at the rare trading posts along the route. This was, nutritionally, an adequate diet for hard physical labor. It was not a pleasant diet, and the men who ate it for 3 months straight were not sentimental about its charms. The arrival at a trail town, at the end of a drive, and the meals available in the restaurants and boarding houses there were genuinely appreciated by men who had been eating biscuits and beef for months and who had the wages to briefly experience something different. The trail towns at the end of the drives, Abilene, Wichita, Dodge City, provided for the cowboys who arrived there after months of physical hardship and social isolation. The specific combination of release that those conditions produced: whiskey, gambling, the company of women, the particular energy of men who have been working hard in difficult conditions and have money in their pockets, and a few days before the next obligation. The mythology has made these trail town arrivals into scenes of dramatic violence. The gunfight in the street, the showdown in the saloon. The reality was considerably more ordinary. Most cowboys arrived in trail towns, spent their wages in a few days, behaved in ways that were disruptive enough to require the attention of the town marshal and not much more, and then either signed on for a return drive or drifted toward whatever came next. The violence was real in the sense that trail town violence was genuinely higher than in more settled communities. It was not the specific, dramatic, individual violence of the mythology. It was the ordinary violence of young men with money and alcohol, and weeks of pent-up tension. The horsemanship of the working cowboy deserves its own examination because it represents the dimension of the work that the mythology has come closest to accurately preserving. The skill was real, and the relationship between the cowboy and his horse was one of the more consequential professional partnerships in the history of American labor. The working cow horse was not the decorative animal of the arena or the show ring. It was a working tool, selected for specific behavioral and physical characteristics that made it useful in the specific context of cattle work, an innate responsiveness to cattle that bordered on instinct, the ability to anticipate the movement of a cow and position itself to block or redirect that movement without explicit direction from the rider, the physical capacity to make the sharp, sudden movements that cattle work required, and the temperament to perform these tasks in conditions of chaos, noise, and danger without losing the composure that made it useful. The training of a cow horse was a specific art developed over generations that the working cowboy practiced not as an aesthetic achievement, but as a practical necessity. A well-trained cow horse was worth more than a month's wages. It was irreplaceable in the field in the sense that no amount of courage or effort on the rider's part could compensate in a critical moment for a horse that did not have the specific skills that the moment required. The cowboy who took good care of his horse, who managed its workload, attended to its feet, recognized the signs of fatigue and injury before they became serious, was protecting an asset that was central to his ability to do his job. The relationship between the cowboy and his horse was therefore not primarily sentimental. Though sentiment was present, it was primarily professional. The relationship of a skilled worker to his primary tool, complicated by the fact that the tool was alive and responsive and capable of a kind of intelligence that no mechanical tool possesses. The cowboy who understood his horse, who knew how it responded to specific situations, what its limits were, how to ask for what the situation required without asking for more than the horse could give, and a genuine working partnership that made him more effective than the cowboy who did not. This is the dimension of cowboy skill that the mythology has preserved most accurately, and it is worth noting that accuracy. The horsemanship was real. The partnership was real. The specific competence of men who could read cattle and horses simultaneously, who could manage a herd of 2,000 animals in a stampede at night, who could rope a running steer from a galloping horse in terrain that offered no margin for error. This was genuinely exceptional, and it is not diminished by the accurate understanding that the men who possessed it were doing so for wages that did not fully reflect its value. The physical toll of cowboy work is documented in the medical and legal records of the era in ways that the mythology has completely erased. The injuries were consistent and serious. Falls from horses, the most common cause of serious injury, occurring with a frequency that reflected how much time the work demanded in close proximity to large, unpredictable animals. Rope burns and crush injuries from cattle handling. Snake bites, which in the era before antivenom were frequently fatal or permanently disabling. Frostbite in the northern ranges where the work continued regardless of the temperature. Heat exhaustion on the Texas summer drives where a man who could not maintain his water intake in 100-degree heat could be disabled within hours. The specific injuries of a stampede where the darkness and the noise and the sheer mass of running animals created conditions in which the margin between riding clear and being trampled was measured in seconds and luck in roughly equal proportion. The longer-term physical consequences of the work were equally significant. Men who had spent years sleeping on the ground in all weather, eating monotonously, performing physically demanding work without adequate recovery time, developed the specific joint and muscle problems that this kind of use produces. Arthritis was common. Hearing loss from the constant noise of large cattle herds was common. The specific damage to the hands and wrists from rope work was common. These were not dramatic injuries. They were the slow accumulation of physical cost that the work imposed, and they arrived in a man's 30s and 40s in ways that the myth of the vigorous, eternally capable cowboy does not accommodate. The accident rates on cattle drives were, by the standards of the era's dangerous industries, significant. A detailed examination of the trail drive records that survive suggests that serious injuries occurred on most drives, and that fatalities, while not routine, were not rare enough to be considered exceptional. The drowning of cowboys in river crossings, where the cattle had to be driven through swollen spring rivers, where a horse that lost its footing or a rider who was swept from the saddle could be in fatal danger within seconds, was the single most consistent cause of death on the trail. These crossings were managed with a specific and learnable set of techniques that experienced trail bosses had developed through the painful process of finding out what did not work. The cattle had to be kept moving, because a cattle herd that stopped in the middle of a river crossing would pile up on itself and drown in numbers that made the crossing a disaster. The lead cattle had to be guided to the opposite bank by experienced horsemen who knew the crossing and whose horses were willing to enter and manage the current. The drag cattle, the slowest, weakest animals at the back of the herd, required particular attention because they were most likely to stop to turn back, to create the jam that would turn a difficult crossing into a catastrophic one. Men died learning these techniques. Men died applying them correctly in conditions where the river was higher than the technique had been calibrated for. The records of specific drives contain specific names and specific crossings and specific circumstances, and they do not read like the mythology. The racial composition of the cowboy workforce is one of the facts most thoroughly erased by the mythology, and its erasure represents one of the more consequential distortions in the popular understanding of what the American West actually was. Approximately one-third of the cowboys working the Texas cattle drives in the years between 1866 and 1886 were black men, former slaves, freed by the Civil War, and finding in the cattle industry one of the few sectors of the frontier economy that offered something approaching equal wages for equal work. Another significant portion were Mexican and Mexican-American men, the vaqueros whose cattle working traditions developed over centuries in Mexico and the Southwest were in fact the direct source of the techniques, the equipment, and the terminology that the Anglo-American cattle industry adopted and eventually claimed as its own. The word lasso is from the Spanish lazo. The word rodeo is Spanish. The word rodeo is Spanish. The word ranch is from rancho. The technique of roping cattle, the design of the Western saddle, the practice of branding, the specific methods of open-range cattle management, all of these were developed by Mexican and Mexican-American vaqueros, working in the traditions of Spanish colonial ranching that preceded the Anglo-American cattle industry by centuries. The Texas cowboy, in the popular imagination, a figure of Anglo-American frontier independence, was in his actual practice the inheritor and user of a skilled tradition that came from somewhere else entirely. The black cowboys who worked alongside these men, who rode the same trails and ate the same food and slept on the same ground, were doing the same work for the same wages and living in the same conditions. Some of them, Nat Love, Bill Pickett, Bo Zycard, left records specific enough to be named and documented. Most of them left the same record as most of their white counterparts, a name in a payroll ledger, if that, and the work itself. The mythology that erased these men from the image of the cowboy was not a passive process. It was the active work of a culture that in the decades following the cattle drive era constructed a specific image of the American West that served specific cultural needs that did not include the complication of a racially diverse workforce doing skilled labor together in conditions of relative equality. The Wild West shows, the dime novels, the films that followed. All of these presented a version of the cowboy that was deliberately and consistently simplified, and the simplification was not neutral. This is not a digression from the history of frontier labor. It is the history of how frontier labor came to be understood and misunderstood in the century that followed it. The end of the open-range cattle era came, as most frontier eras came, through the intersection of economic change and physical reality in ways that the optimism of the boom years had not fully anticipated. The winter of 1886-1887, the same winter that killed the underprepared cattle herds of the northern ranges, was the most immediate and dramatic cause. But the conditions that made that winter catastrophic had been building for years. The ranges that had been adequate for the herds of the 1870s were overstocked by the 1880s. As Eastern and British investment poured into the cattle industry during the boom years and expanded the herds beyond what the grass could sustain, a drought in 1886 had already reduced the grass cover when the winter arrived. The animals that went into the winter of 1886 to 1887 were on overgrazed ranges, in reduced condition, and the winter killed them in numbers that ended the open-range cattle industry as it had existed. The barbed wire that was spreading across the range by the mid-1880s was the other agent of the era's end. Barbed wire, invented in 1873, manufactured cheaply and in enormous quantities within a few years. Strung across the range by farmers and smaller ranchers who were enclosing their water sources and their grass, made the open range that the cattle drives depended on progressively less open. A drive that had been able to move freely across 500 miles of unfenced country in 1875 encountered fences, detours, and legal disputes by 1885. The economics of the long drive deteriorated as the route became more complicated and more expensive. What replaced the open-range cattle industry was ranch-based cattle production. Cattle raised on fenced, owned, or leased range, fed through the winter rather than left to forage, managed year-round by a smaller and more permanent workforce. This was a different kind of work, requiring different skills and different labor organization. The seasonal trail cowboy, hired for a drive and let go at its end, was replaced by the year-round ranch hand, whose work was more regular, less dramatic, and in some respects more demanding in its persistence. The working cowboy of the ranch era, the man who fed cattle through a Wyoming winter, who mended fences in April rain, who rode the range in summer checking water sources and salt licks and the condition of the herd, was doing work that was as physically demanding as the trail drive work and considerably less celebrated. He did not have the trail town at the end of the drive to look forward to. He had the bunkhouse and the ranch cook and the next day's work. The bunkhouse was the domestic reality of the ranch cowboy's life, and it was not a comfortable reality. A bunkhouse typically housed 8 to 12 men in a space that was built for function rather than comfort. Wooden bunks, a central stove, minimal light, and the particular smell of men and leather and horses that accumulates in an enclosed space occupied by working people with limited access to bathing facilities. The social world of the bunkhouse was small and intensive, the same men in the same space for months at a time, with the limited relief of occasional visits to the nearest town and the social variety that those visits provided. The men who got along well in that world were men who had developed specific social skills that the mythology of the solitary cowboy does not acknowledge. The ability to manage conflict without escalation in a confined space, the social intelligence to read when a fellow worker was near a limit and to give him room, the specific humor of people who have learned to find the comedy in shared hardship because the alternative is to take the hardship personally. These were social skills that the work required and that the mythology erased, because the mythology needed the cowboy to be solitary and self-sufficient and emotionally uncomplicated in ways that actual human beings who live in close social proximity for extended periods are not. The actual cowboy, the man in the bunkhouse negotiating the social dynamics of 8 men in a small room through a long winter, was considerably more socially sophisticated than his legend allows. What the working cowboy of the cattle drive era actually represents, stripped of the mythology and examined on its own terms, is something that appears throughout the history of frontier labor. A man of genuine skill performing genuinely difficult work, under conditions that were genuinely demanding for an economic return that did not fully reflect the value of what he contributed. This is not a unique description. It describes most skilled physical labor in most eras of industrial capitalism. What makes the cowboy's version of it distinctive, and what the mythology has preserved while distorting, is the specific setting, the scale of the landscape, the specific quality of the work, the genuine excellence that the best of the men achieved in skills that are difficult to develop and difficult to fake. The horsemanship was real. The cattle sense was real. The physical endurance was real. The specific kind of competence that allowed a man to manage 2,000 animals in a river crossing at night, or to spot the signs of a stampede before it started and position himself and his horse to contain it, was genuinely exceptional and genuinely hard-won. The mythologization of the cowboy did not invent this excellence. It took something real and simplified it, stripped away the labor conditions and the racial complexity and the physical cost and the economic reality, and left an image that was powerful precisely because it was incomplete. The image could carry the weight of cultural meaning that the complete picture could not, because the complete picture complicated the story in ways that the cultural need for the story did not accommodate. Understanding the complete picture does not diminish the real excellence it contains. It places that excellence in its actual context, the context of skilled labor done for inadequate wages in difficult conditions by men of varied backgrounds who did not look like the image that the culture eventually made of them, and who would not recognize themselves in the mythology that bears their name. The cattle are gone from those trails now. The chuck wagon is in a museum. The trail towns are small cities or ghost towns or somewhere in between, but the ground was covered and the cattle got to market and the work was done, not by the figure of the legend, but by the men who actually did it in the specific, difficult, unremarked reality of their actual lives. The sun comes up the same way it always did over the Texas plains. The grass bends in the same wind, and somewhere in the distance, if you know what you are looking at, you can still see the faint traces of where the cattle walked. The ground pressed down by the passage of a million hooves, still slightly different from the ground on either side, the specific mark of work that was real and is over and deserves to be remembered accurately.